Hello, everyone. My name is Andrés Velasco. I'm the Dean of the School of Public Policy at the London School of Economics, and I want to welcome everyone to this event in which we are very, very happy to be joined by Fareed Zakaria. This is one more in LSE's long list of events this year, many of which, not all of which, have had to do with the subject of the year, COVID, of course. I am delighted in particular to welcome Fareed, who is a dear friend and is someone who does not need much of an introduction. As I'm sure everybody here on this call knows, Fareed hosts Fareed Zakaria GPS, which is an international affairs program that airs on CNN. He is also a columnist for the Washington Post and a contributing editor for The Atlantic, the magazine in the US. In 2019, Foreign Policy named him a top 10 global thinker of the last 10 years. Fareed is a fellow Yale. He earned a bachelor's degree from Yale University and a PhD in political science from Harvard. He's written a bunch of books in defense of a liberal education, and in 2015, The Post-American World in 2008, and my personal favorite, The Future of Freedom, a study of illiberal democracy around the world. And that book was published back in 2003. And of course, Fareed is joining us today to discuss his most recent book, the title of which is 10 Lessons for a Post-Pandemic World. Fareed, welcome and thank you for joining us. The rules of our conversation, the rules of engagement are as follows. We're going to give Fareed about 15 minutes, flexible, so that he can tell us a bit about the book and the main points of the book. Then we will have an informal conversation, and then we will be happy to open it up for Q&A with the audience, which is looking like a pretty numerous audience with people joining from all corners of the world. So Fareed, without further ado, over to you. And again, thanks for joining us.
Andres, this is a huge pleasure for me. I have actually been to the LSE to launch every one of my books. And so this follows in a great tradition. In fact, the LSE, I have a special place in my heart for it because my father came to the LSE as a scholarship student in 1944 in the middle of World War II to get what he thought was going to be a PhD with Harold Lasky, the great social democratic intellectual. Lasky, in fact, told him that he was not really an economist. He was more of a historian, and sent him off to SOAS, which is where he did get his PhD. But as a result, I've always had a soft spot for the LSE. And so it's a thrill and an honor to be here. What I thought I'd do is begin, as you said, by just outlining a few of the central themes that I want to talk about, and then we can go in whatever direction the audience would like. And by the way, if people want to ask questions that are unrelated to the book, I know that there's an event taking place in the United States next Tuesday that there might be some scattered interest in. I'm happy to talk about that as well. To me, the most striking thing about COVID-19 and the pandemic is the degree to which it really is probably the most universal crisis that has faced us. If you think about it, I was talking to an Indian businessman once about 9/11 and the global financial crisis, and he pointed out that his life didn't change much at all. That 9/11 was an event involving the United States and the Middle East, some Middle Eastern countries. It changed a little bit of the airport procedures for much of the world, but that was it. The global financial crisis, he said he never had any leveraged products. He never had derivatives of any kind, as did true of most Indian businesses. So, there was a decline in demand as a result of the recession, but not much. This pandemic, I think it can almost literally be said, has affected every human being on the planet. Everybody's life in some way or the other has been changed by either the public health crisis or the economic crisis that followed this extraordinary process of shutdowns. I kind of call it the great paralysis, because we literally froze economic activity around the world. And so it's one of the reasons I wrote the book, because it made me realize there's something very large that is going to unravel and unfold as we go through it. And let me try to sketch some of the outlines of it. We can talk about the countries that did well and the countries that did poorly and what lessons we can draw from that. But to me, the larger lesson I got was that we have been living life and developing in a way that has taken on greater and greater speed, greater and greater acceleration, and greater risks without seeming to be quite aware of those risks, let alone mitigating them. So if you look at, what has happened over the last 20 years, as I say, you've had this great geopolitical shock, 9/11, the great geoeconomic shock, the global financial crisis, and now a great biological shock or public health shock. And they're all part of a larger narrative, I think, which is we have been running the world, or we have created a system that runs very fast, is very open, but is quite unstable. So you think about the kind of ceaseless growth of Western power, Western interests, Western ideas, and Western governance around the world after the collapse of the Cold War. And in that process of expanding the world, globalizing it, setting Western standards for governance everywhere, we didn't notice that there were parts of the world that were resistant to it, angrily resistant to it. And that is, of course, the backlash we saw coming out of a small part of the Muslim world, but a very angry and very determined part. As we ceaselessly deregulated finance and finance capitalism around the world, and as you know better than I do, Andrés, that has been the most striking growth. I mean, global trade has grown, but it is really capital flows that have gone crazy over the last 20 years. We didn't seem to realize that this was creating certain kinds of vulnerabilities and instabilities. And then you get this small product, the credit default swap, which cascades into an enormous market, $45 trillion at its peak, which then takes down the world economy. And now we have this viral speck in a bat somewhere in Wuhan that has morphed into the greatest global pandemic we've had since the Spanish influenza. And when I look at those, I think to myself, what's next? Well, we can imagine the outlines of what could be next. Climate change. We continue to develop, we continue to pour carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and we assume it'll all work out. And one of the things I was struck by in writing this book was when you talk to the most serious scientists in the world, Joshua Lederberg, the Nobel Prize winning biologist, he said that the great mistake we seem to make is that we assume that nature is benign and has a kind of fondness for human beings and for human life. And he said the thing we need to understand is nature is neutral. It is a bunch of chemical equations. And if those equations go wrong, it could easily wipe out life on the planet Earth. And he points out that we have asserted dominion over every element of the natural environment, except viruses, except the smallest of those, these tiny little particles that could destroy the entire human race. And he convened a conference in 1989 because he began worrying about this. When you talk to people who study climate change seriously, they point out you can imagine a set of cascading events that could take place regarding climate that just take us in a different place. You look at the way in which we eat now, the number of countries in the world where there is a massive rise in meat consumption, which is then fulfilled by, first of all, an enormous amount of farmland devoted to it, which emits huge amounts of greenhouse gases. And then you can only satisfy this by factory farming, which is essentially an invitation for the next pandemic, because you take thousands of animals, crowd them together in unsanitary conditions. You put genetic variations, you deselect genetic variations because, for example, with chickens, you want them all to have big fat breasts. And that means that you lose any kind of natural break on the process by which a virus hops from animal to animal, gaining strength and eventually gaining the ability to hop from an animal to a human. That is why we have had SARS, MERS, Ebola, all these zoonotic viruses starting in animals, jumping to humans. And so I put all that together and I ask myself, it's almost as though we're driving a very fast race car. And we've decided that we're going to do it in unmarked, uncharted terrain. We're not going to worry about seatbelts. We're not going to worry about airbags. We're not going to bother to buy insurance. Every now and then the car blows up. We fix the engine and we get back to it, and we resolve to drive a little bit more carefully. But soon speed takes over. And at the most fundamental level, I think we all have to ask ourselves, is there a different way to do this? Is there a different way for us to develop? We want the dynamism. We want the growth. You and I both come from countries in which for many decades you had stagnation, and then you had growth, and you had the alleviation of poverty. So I'm a big fan of growth and dynamism, but I want us to do it in a more sustainable way. I want us to find a way to put some of those seatbelts on, put those airbags on, and find a way to recognize that, there's a danger here that you have to plan for, which is that the next crisis could be the last crisis.
Thank you, Farid. I think that's a great introduction into the very big issues that the book is putting on the table. Let me begin with one thing you just said. I think that the analogy between the financial blowups and the health blowups is a helpful one, in that, as you put it, we're going very fast. We are running some risks. These are low probability events. We tend to underestimate the chances that we will be hit in the face and suddenly it happens. Now, the problem with that analogy is that we've been very bad at dealing with financial risk. I'm a macroeconomist. That's my stock and trade. I've been studying financial crises. And of course, we hadn't had worldwide financial crisis, since the Great Depression, but we had one 10 years ago. We're having one today. But in the middle, we had the Russian crisis and the Mexican crisis and the Latin American debt crisis and the East Asian crisis in the late 90s. So the precedent that the financial crises seem to suggest is that as political decision-making bodies or nations, we're not very good at dealing with those low probability events. What are the chances, do you think, that this shock, the current COVID shock, will be so big that our politicians and our decision makers will say, stop, 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 let's put the foot on the brake? Or alternatively, maybe it'll just be like finance, that we have one crisis, we paper it over, and we take a deep breath, and 5 years later or 8 years later, we have a bigger one. Are you optimistic or are you pessimistic in that respect?
I'm an optimist, so I have to, and it's temperamental. So I will not pretend that piece of it is entirely determined by the evidence. But I think that one can see the outlines of why these things happen. And you correct me if I'm wrong, Andrés, but I notice, as you pointed out, from the 1930s, when roughly speaking, the most powerful countries in the finance capital put in place a lot of regulations after the Great Depression. From the 1930s to the 1980s, you had very few financial crises. And then you had the Reagan-Thatcher revolution and the start of the deregulation of global finance. And you outlined them exactly right. The Latin American debt crisis, the tequila crisis, the East Asian crisis, the Russian default, the savings and loans scandal. So we can see that, now I want to emphasize, because people forget the other side of the point. We got a lot of dynamism and we got a lot of growth. But the danger is always that low probability event turns out to be so large that you sacrifice a lot. I think if you look at how much the global financial crisis has put us back, it's possibly decades, particularly for the middle class, for people who did not have a lot of savings, particularly because, and again, I'm venturing into your territory, the only solution we seem to have is low interest rates, which inflates assets, which means the rich do well because the rich tend to own financial assets. The pandemic, I think, is likely to produce some real regulation. I use the word metaphorically.
Right.
If you think about this, if we do it right, most of the countries that really did well in handling this pandemic are countries that failed during the SARS and MERS crises. So Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, Japan, all faced a series of zoonotic viruses about 15 years ago. Most of them did badly at it, but they all learned from that failure, and they revamped their public health systems, and they made a certain set of decisions. And that this is the gold standard of how to handle this pandemic, which is they acted early on the theory that, better to be safe. They acted aggressively with regard to travel bans, for example, from people from China. And they acted highly intelligently and surgically. None of the countries I mentioned, which are really the best at handling this, did a lockdown. All of them instead did testing, tracing, and then isolating the potentially infected. In doing this, you actually achieve the perfect outcome, because a lockdown is a sign of failure. You have already failed if the only method you have is this big, blunt instrument of crushing the economy. So what the Taiwan vice president who ran it told me, by the way, a Johns Hopkins trained epidemiologist, I think he got lucky. He said, our strategy was to say we're going to isolate 1% of the population. They ended up isolating 250,000 people for 14 days, in return for which the other 24 million are able to go about their lives normally. And by the way, Taiwan is a democracy. This was not done with any kind of authoritarian measures. But by doing that, they found a way to achieve really the best possible outcome. Taiwan has had the lowest drop in its GDP of any country around. Now, I'm not as confident that the West in particular can learn, because, what I worry about is that there's a lot of, it's a combination of inertia and arrogance in the Western world, which says we're the best, we do everything well, we don't need to learn from anybody else. If you look at the countries that have done particularly badly, Andrés, they're the countries that tend to be quite smug and have the sense of being special. The United States, the United Kingdom, Brazil, to a certain extent Chile, which has thought of itself as the kind of East Asian miracle in Latin America, Israel. All these countries have done particularly badly because they don't seem to be willing to learn from failure, which is, as you know, one of the primary ways that capitalism is meant to work.
Let me stick with the analogy between finance and viruses. They're both contagious, but now move the conversation onto politics. The world financial crisis 10 years ago was not the only factor, but it was one of the factors that gave us populism, demagoguery, Donald Trump in the US, Modi in your own country, Bolsonaro in Brazil, etc., etc., etc. So the political fallout from the financial crisis was gigantic. This crisis will surely also have political consequences, not just business consequences. And there's sort of two views out there. One is, well, this is the kind of crisis in which, we're all vulnerable, rich and poor, white and black, we can all get sick together. People have come together, in my block here in London, people would gather at 8 p.m. every Thursday and applaud the NHS. So the optimistic view is that we come out of this more united. The pessimistic view is that the crisis has affected people differentially. You say in your book that inequality will get worse. And therefore, rather than being in one boat all rowing in the same direction, people are saying, a few got furloughs, I got nothing. And as a result, the trend toward populism will be intensified. And of course, if the latter is true, if populism is in fact strengthened by the crisis, the chances that countries in the West and countries like Brazil or India will in fact mend their ways would seem to be lessened. Will populism be a winner or be a loser of this particular episode, Fareed?
It is the big political question, and I don't pretend that I can tell you with certainty where it goes. But here's the thing I notice. I think there is no doubt that the net effect of this crisis, of this pandemic, is to massively increase inequality. The what you described, the demonstrations of solidarity, as you know, are paper thin compared to the massive widening of the gap that is taking place. First of all, it's taking place among nations. The rich nations, particularly ones that can issue debt in their own currencies, are in a completely different planet than the poor countries that will not be able to do that. And they have no ability to spend. The big companies.
If I can interject something,
Sure.
I was on a call the other day with a dear friend who used to be the Minister of Finance of Colombia, and I thought he put your point very, very pithily. He said, the European countries and the countries in North America are doing whatever it takes, echoing Mario Draghi. We in Latin America are doing whatever we can afford. And there's a world of difference between the two, right?
That's right. That it echoes in a way that I love that line, because it echoes the line in Thucydides' Peloponnesian War and the Melian dialogue, where he says, the strong do what they can, the weak do what they must. Right. And we are back in that kind of world. But then think about companies. Take my own book. Book sales are actually up around the world, because believe it or not, there are some people who are not spending all their time on Netflix. They are reading more. So this is one of those industries that has actually been positively affected by COVID. But here's the difference. Amazon was 30% of the book market in the United States when COVID began. We don't know for sure, but it looks like it's something like 60% of the book market now. It has literally doubled its market share.
It's 100% of my book market.
that is happening, and that is happening in company after company. The big ones with large diversified operations, either geographically or in terms of product lines, with strong brands, with deep lines of credit, they're doing well. Right. The mom and pop grocery store, the mom and pop hardware store, those are doing badly. And then you look at human beings. Those of us, Andrés, who can work digitally are really truly blessed, because we have had inconvenience. I would much prefer to be in that auditorium at the LSE and actually see the people who I'm talking to. But this has advantages. As you say, you're getting people from around the world. But for anyone working in restaurants, hotels, cruise ships, parks, shopping malls, retail, this is the Great Depression. Work has simply disappeared. And that inequality is surely going to have a huge impact. The place where I'm not sure where it'll end up is this. The global financial crisis, you're absolutely right, had the peculiar effect, despite the fact that it was a crisis caused largely by the irresponsibility of the private sector, it produced a move not left, but right. You ended up almost everywhere with right-wing populism doing well. I think that this pandemic, because it really feels like one of those acts of God, where, people must look at their lives and say to themselves, I am in this position for no fault of my own. I didn't take on excess debt. I did not manage my business irresponsibly. I was not, I was hardworking in my job, and I am unemployed. It is probably a place where people feel this is where government steps in. This is where we need collective action. So I could imagine that we end up with much greater inequality, and therefore a push for governments to do something about that inequality. So I think you are likely to see a much more expanded role for the government, which will, by the way, have a mixed, there will be a loss of efficiency and there will be all kinds of things. I think there's a way to get it right. As you know, I'm a fan of the Northern Europeans and particularly the Danes, because they actually combine very strong free markets with very strong social protections. But it's a very difficult combination to achieve. And what's more likely to happen is we will move in a more traditionally social democratic direction. So I think the jury is out in what direction we will go, but there's no question that this rise in inequality is going to have a long-term effect. It will probably shape the next generation of politics.
Yes, the Danish model of flexicurity is, I think, what you have in mind. It's a great combination. It's not easy to sell politically. When I was a minister in Chile, I advocated Danish flexicurity for the Chilean labor market. I'm afraid I was alone in the cabinet making that case. We didn't get very far. In your book, Fareed, you also talk about trust. It seems that trust has been very important in this crisis. As you hinted a minute ago, countries that are high trust societies seem to have done well because government says do something and people follow. There's a different kind of trust, which is very much related to the phenomenon of populism, is trust in elites, trust in experts, trust in science. And again, here, one can imagine the crisis playing itself out in two different directions. On the one hand, scientists have been re-empowered. Donald Trump, Boris Johnson were having press conferences flanked by people in white aprons because science has a credibility that politicians can only hope to have. On the other hand, as you point out in the book, science does not have all the answers, particularly in a new phenomenon such as this pandemic, about which we really knew quite little. So another race is unfolding. Sometimes I think that we'll come out of this with new respect for expert knowledge, or sometimes I feel that the elites will be further devalued. I will confess that I have a particular interest in this because I'm the dean of a school of public policy, so our business is to train experts. And I'd like to know whether the experts that we train will be in high demand or low demand in today's world, Fareed. What do you think?
Oh, there's no question they'll be in high demand, but they will be controversial. I think that's the point, and you yourself wrote a very fine piece about this. Yeah. I think the danger here is that we turn this into an entirely partisan or polemical issue about people who don't listen to experts and people who do. Trump makes it easy. Boris Johnson makes it easy. Bolsonaro makes it easy because they're being stupid. And they will be, foolishly not listening to simple public policy guidelines that are actually not even that onerous, like mask wearing. The more complicated question is twofold. One, the reality about science, as you know, is there is no simple answer that holds forever. We are learning about this illness as we go along. And we need to make the public understand that of course there will be some missteps. We don't know exactly why, for example, in Asia and in Africa, the virus is just not as lethal. It may be the inbuilt immunity of those populations. It may be other factors that we don't understand. And so a certain amount of humility and understanding that science is actually a mode of inquiry, that what you say is we ask the questions, we pose the hypotheses, and we rigorously test them. And that's how you get it. Let people in on the secret. But the more important issue is this has gotten caught up in a great class divide that is affecting almost every country. It's certainly my sense, being in places like Chile and Brazil, is that it's as true there as it is in Britain and the United States. We all remember Michael Gove's famous comment during Brexit. The British public has had enough of experts. What he was expressing,
although he's walked it back since, he claims now that he loves experts.
Yes. But Trump said something similar on the campaign trail. And what they were playing to is this great divide, and resentment between basically educated elites on the one hand and less educated people. And the divide piles upon differences, so that what we're talking about is people urban versus rural, educated or college educated versus non-college educated, cosmopolitan versus somewhat parochial, people who work tend to work in service industries with their minds, people who work in the regular economy or the material economy with their hands. And that divide is becoming larger and larger. And there is a great deal of resentment among the less educated class for the more educated class. And I think this is something we have to be very conscious of and aware of. And when you say as a school of public policy, I think one of the things that schools of public policy and all of us need to think a lot about is, how do we convey information? How do we convey ideas to people who may not have the same training, who may not have the same background? how do you show that you empathize? How do you show that you understand? Is there a way to connect these two worlds? Because otherwise, we end up with the situation we're in the United States and in Brazil, and to a lesser extent, but to a certain extent in Britain, where this elite advice is viewed as the kind of the masters of the nanny state telling the rest of the country what to do. And it shouldn't be that way. And so there has to be some better way to interact. And it's also would go a long way to solve what has become an increasingly political class divide anyway.
No, I think that's a really key point. And of course, we and the chattering classes and the elites have a bit of apologizing to do. I mean, think of Hillary's comment, the famous comment about the Trump voters being no good, being a bunch of deplorables. That's exactly what elites should not be doing if they want to earn the trust of voters once again. If I can put in a plug for my school just for a second, one of the things that we've been doing is, creating courses, for instance, in political philosophy, because if you're going to be a leader today or a leader in the realm of public policy, people will want to know whether your policy is fair, whether it adds or detracts to people's autonomy or freedom. And typically schools of public policy are worried about technicalities, but not about those kinds of issues which are going to be paramount in people's minds. But that very takes us into, again, the subject matter of politics, because you're absolutely right. Without science, we cannot hope to solve problems like contagion and pandemics. At the same time, in today's political environment, what is fact and what is fiction, what is truth and what is post-truth gets very hard to tell apart. If one has watched the American debates, Donald Trump does not miss an opportunity to say this virus that we imported from China, right? So Trump is running a campaign in which the virus is the fault of the Chinese, is not the fault of deregulation or the elites or simply bad luck. So I have to ask you the question, you kind of asked for it in the beginning. Is the conventional wisdom right? Is the mishandling of the virus and the crisis going to cost Donald Trump the presidency? And if so, what do we learn from that experience?
Andrés, it's a good example of, once again, of whether does one rely on experts or does one not. So I tend to, my training is to believe in facts and to believe in expertise. And I think that the polls are going to be roughly right. What I think will happen is the race will tighten toward the end. There will be a greater intensity of support for Trump than we see right now. But Biden is leading by, at this point, Biden is leading by the largest lead that any presidential candidate has had over another since 1996, when Bill Clinton had about a 9-point lead over Bob Dole. It has been a fairly consistently. There is no point since early March, when Biden became the presumptive nominee, that Trump has led. There is literally not been a week that Trump has led. And also, it's worth pointing out that the state polls, which were wrong the last time around because they underestimated the number of non-college educated people, that was the central issue, have tried to adjust for this. And the X factor in the last election, 2016, which was a very high number of people who said they were undecided and turned out to be secret Trump voters, has declined dramatically. It was 12% in 2016. It's 3% now, which is the historical norm. So you don't have a lot of room for those secret Trump voters right now. People are declaring how they vote. Now, all that said, many of the states are within the margin of error. And so, which is 3 to 4%. Biden is leading by 2% in Florida. He's leading by 4 or 5% in Pennsylvania. So you could certainly imagine a path where all the breaks move in Trump's direction, that he wins. But if one were a betting man, one would have to bet on Biden.
I hope you're right. I hope that last bet pays. Let me ask you one last question, and then we'll open it up to the audience, and I can see lots of questions coming in. And let me connect the last thing you said with one of the closing chapters in your book. If Biden is the president, um, needless to say, he has plenty of work to do. And you end the book with an invitation for politicians to think big. You know, that the title, maybe it's not the last chapter, but one of the last chapters is, you know, sometimes, you know, the realists are the best. No, the idealists are the best realists. What exactly do you have in mind? Are politicians thinking too small and it is time to paint on a larger canvas? What kind of idealism do we need to face these very big challenges going forward?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. But the biggest canvas I want people to start with is to recognize that we have really built an astonishing world since World War II. If you think back comparatively and historically, um, you know, think about what the world looked like before that. 400 years of ceaseless war between the richest countries of the world and endless, inexorable poverty in other parts of the world, which were then subjected to colonialism and domination. And since 45, while it's a mixed record, the basic trajectory has been peace among the great powers, stability, and a widening degree of shared prosperity. So we have gone, you know, the millennial goals of the UN in terms of poverty reduction were actually achieved 5 years ahead of schedule. Nobody dreamed that that was possible. And you know, you don't have to be to believe everything Steven Pinker writes, but to note that on all these measures, there has been so much progress that the first order of business is to make sure that we stabilize, reimagine, and revivify the world and the systems and structure that allowed that to happen. So what does that mean? That means making sure that a rising China, a rising India, a rising Brazil are integrated into the existing world order so that they don't go and freelance or create their own set of structures. Obviously, this is most important for China because China is essentially now the other superpower. And if you have a Cold War between the United States and China, well, say goodbye to that open global system, say goodbye to open technological platforms, say goodbye to open trading. And so I worry a lot that we are going down narrow paths of self-interest in a very traditional fashion, almost like the 1930s, and not thinking about the long-term consequence that this will end up undoing and unraveling this extraordinary open world order that we have created. I worry that we are not thinking big enough in terms of tackling things like climate change, tackling things like the dangers of nuclear arms races, of cyber attacks, of space races. You know, all these areas we need to say to ourselves, you know, what is the most idealistic outcome? A world that lives in peace and harmony and with greater prosperity, and it's actually achievable. We've gotten many steps of the way there. It's a very daunting challenge, but why not try it? I mean, and I point out in the book, the strangest thing is that the statesmen who saw the worst of humanity, who went through the Great Depression and World War II, Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, de Gaulle, Adenauer, they came out of it determined to build this idealistic system. Now we have statesmen who have lived through times of peace and plenty and prosperity, who with one pandemic are suddenly turning inward into this narrow, selfish, parochial worldview. And so I'm hoping to revive that tradition of liberal internationalism that really has changed the world.
I think it's a very important and powerful message. I mean, Pinker may not be right in everything, but I think the basic message of Pinker is right. The last century has been a very good century for humanity, and as you point out, since 1945, it's been especially good. So there's a lot at stake. Now, it does not. If I had to guess, the prospects for that international liberal set of arrangements which gave us the post-45 world, they're going to be pretty hard to rebuild because the natural tendency, regrettably today, is to look inward. But I guess the jury's still out on that one. Let me turn to some of the questions coming in. Sarmad Haider from London, an LSE undergrad, third year. And here's the question. he says that there's massive variation, as we pointed out, in the success of government responses to COVID-19. Is this simply a matter of good leaders or bad leaders? Is it a matter of democracies or non-democracies, or is some other factor at work?
It's a great question, Salman. I think here's how I would put it. It is pretty clear what the best response to COVID has been, and that is the East Asian countries. Mm-hmm. So if you look at Taiwan, with 24 million people, Taiwan has, I think, 8 COVID deaths. It's really astonishing. Mm-hmm. New York State alone, with 19 million people, has 34,000 deaths. So, they're off the charts, as is South Korea, Singapore, Vietnam, Japan. So we know what the right strategy, the gold standard is. Now, the countries that were not able to act early, aggressively, and intelligently in that surgical way that I described, there it gets much more mixed. I think that it's fair to say that Germany probably is the best country in Europe in terms of the way it has handled this, particularly because it's very large. I think it's fair to say that the US and the UK probably handled it the worst. Though Belgium had a very bad outbreak, we're not entirely sure why. There is no correlation between dictatorships and democracies. Some of the best performers were democracies. Some of the best performers were dictatorships. In general, it's
although it is true that most populists did very poorly.
Yes, the populist democracies did particularly poorly. As with economic growth, what probably happens is you look at the successful dictatorships and make the mistake of thinking that that is a quality of dictatorship rather than a quality of the successful part. In other words, the high functioning part. So we look at China, we look at Vietnam, and we look at Singapore, which is sort of authoritarian. But we forget there are lots of Belaruses and Irans and places like that have done terribly. So I would say the most important thing to recognize is that there are pathways that have been better than others. But I think that we need to really learn and be humble through this experience. So, back to the whole point about medical experts, the medical experts all wanted to do a lockdown. And as I say, except in East Asia, where they really had gone through this process and understood the cost of the lockdowns, I think the lockdowns were counterproductive in most third world countries, in most developing countries. So in India, the lockdown, a 3-week shutdown, probably resulted in more excess deaths from child malnutrition alone than all the COVID deaths. So if the goal was to save lives, it was lost. If the goal was is to prevent overcrowding in hospitals, where India doesn't have much of a hospital system anyway, so you didn't need to worry about that. So net was probably a bad decision. So that's why you need not just medical experts. You need economists, you need urban specialists, you need everybody pooling in to try to get at the right answer. What we do know in the Western world is we can learn from East Asia. And that is something that I think we need to actively start doing, on a number of fronts, but on public health in general.
Oh, I think you're absolutely right. This may be one more reason for the kind of somewhat arrogant attitude that some rich countries have about where the right lessons are. The real winner in this particular crisis are small countries, most of which don't happen to be in Western Europe or North America. There's a question here about the US, which is very critical. It says what's striking about the US, and this is from a second year undergraduate student also at the LSE, striking about the US is the pulling out from the WHO, the failure of the CDC, the politicization of reporting and treatment, the disbanding of a particular US task force devoted to the pandemic. How do we understand the failure of a major country, a rich country, a developed country like the US, to get things so wrong, so systematically? Is it all Trump? Is it all politics? Or is there something more fundamental at work here?
It's a great question. I'd say there are 2 things going on. One, don't underestimate the degree to which Trump screwed it up. Because the truth of the matter is in the American government is a very complicated, unwieldy enterprise. And this is partly because the United States is in its DNA an anti-statist country. And so you have power distributed among three branches, dozens of federal agencies, and then really located mostly at the local and state level. So it takes a kind of heroic energy and focus for the White House to direct a national strategy. But it has been done. It was done by Franklin Roosevelt, it was done by Lyndon Johnson. It was even done by George W. Bush with regard to things like PEPFAR, the AIDS in Africa program. It was done by Obama with regard to the Ebola crisis. So it is possible. But Trump fundamentally doesn't believe in governing. I mean, he views the presidency as a reality TV show. And so most of the things you talked about in your question were things that were really, because the one of the most revealing aspects of John Bolton's memoirs is that he would go to the White House every day, and as he said, nobody was ever actually doing anything. There was no real policy being implemented. It was literally every day a series of emotional reactions to whatever Trump had watched on Fox News that morning, and the issuing of diktat related to it. And so that piece of it, if you're not trying to govern, guess what? You're not going to govern. There is a larger piece here, which is that the Republican Party has for 30 or 40 years now set itself to destroy, defund, delegitimize the federal government. You remember when Ronald Reagan comes into office, in his inaugural address, he says, government is not the solution, government is the problem. The 9 scariest words in the English language. He said, I am from the government and I'm here to help. Imagine if somebody, were to say that today. I mean, that's not exactly how you handle a pandemic. When Trump came into power, Steve Bannon, his ideological guru, said the goal of the Trump revolution is the deconstruction of the administrative state. So if that is your goal, and Republicans have been in charge for a large part of that, guess what? You're going to succeed. And I think it really confused the issue of having limited government with having effective government. In other words, what we can all agree that you do not want an overbearing, overwhelming, overpowering state. But what state you have should be respected, well funded, given independence, and given the capacity to perform at a high level. And that's why the interesting thing here is some of the countries that did best actually have small states. The East Asian countries, as a percentage of GDP, spend much less, but then some have big states like Germany. The issue is, can you give them respect, autonomy, independence, fund them properly, and then they'll perform well. The American failure, therefore, is this slightly larger systemic one, which is the delegitimizing of the federal government over the last 4 decades. But I wouldn't let Trump off the hook too much. I mean, other than the CDC, which was a genuine mistake in sending out the faulty kits, every other error that the questioner asked about can be pretty directly attributed to Trump.
I think a fascinating question for the future of politics and for the future of democracy is whether, after such a massive policy failure, the voters will hold Trump to account in the polls, or whether, in fact, there will be enough people out there believing that it's really all China's fault. We will know. In a week, we will know. Something else that the book says that is very important, which you just hinted at, Fareed, and I'd like to stress it and underscore it for a minute, is that one of the lessons of this pandemic is that it is not all about small government versus big government. It is really about effective government. And I mention this because in the aftermath of the crisis, as you pointed out 5 minutes ago, there will be much greater political demand for government to do more. And a big outstanding question is, what kind of a government, what kind of a civil service, what kind of public institutions do we need? It's not simply that 40% of GDP will get it right while 30 did not. Taiwan has a small state. South Korea has a fairly small state. Singapore has a fairly small state. I'm not arguing that small states alone are the solution, far from it. Guatemala has a small state and is not doing very well. but we need to go beyond the old-fashioned 1960s style discussion of big versus small, because that's not going to take us very far. And you have a very good chapter in the book exactly on that. But let me return to the international arena. There are several questions that have to do with that. Um, there is Isabella Picon from Venezuela, who says the pandemic seems to be strengthening the tendency for both authoritarian populists and other kinds of governments to turn inward, while clearly what we need today is more international cooperation. And Andrei Menshikov, I'm not sure where Andrei is from, he doesn't say, says, what is your take, Fareed, on how COVID-19 will change the world order and the balance of power? Are we going to have more international cooperation or more isolation?
So there's no question that the first effect of the pandemic was to make nations look inward. And people and countries talked about how they needed to close their borders, how they needed to onshore various kinds of manufacturing industries because they wanted to be able to supply, produce the face masks and things like that. And I think what is now happening is we're getting to a slightly more sensible place. Because, for example, I think people are beginning to realize the idea of completely upending your economic system so that you can produce face masks is silly. That really what you need is there was a 1 month or 2 month period where you were short of these supplies, after which the private sectors of every country was able to very quickly start producing them. What you need is some kind of strategic stockpile of some medical supplies for pandemics, cotton swabs, glass vials, face masks, gloves and PPE, things like that. After which the private sector can very easily do it. To instead say that the government should fund, an industrial policy that produces all the potential things you will need in the next crisis, which, by the way, is likely to be very different from the last crisis, and therefore will require a different set of equipment. Let's say the next one is massive forest fires or something like that. You're not going to do very much with face masks. So, the much more sensible strategy would be to rely on the extraordinary power of this international system. After all, we were able to get face masks in the United States precisely because of the global economy, because we were able to import them from, among other places, China for a month or two until you could start producing. But more broadly, as you say, clearly the optimal solution is more cooperation, more exchange of information, more pooling of resources. And in some areas that's happening, by the way. That's one of the reasons why you were able to source and get supplies. That's one of the reasons why scientists have been able to collaborate and achieve much faster results than they would have were they operating in isolation. But at the political level, so far, the only place that seems to have understood this correctly is Europe. So the Europeans began in exactly the same way, by turning inward, closing their borders even to one another, and blaming each other. The Italians blamed the Germans blamed the Italians, everybody blamed the Belgians. And then there was a kind of moment, a turning point, when they seemed to realize, my God, we are sacrificing the European experiment in this petty parochialism. And the Germans and the French got together and have decided to do, as you know, what was long considered unthinkable, which is essentially to guarantee the debt of the poorer countries. Now, it's a temporary measure, it's an emergency measure, but it's a big step forward. And so it's quite conceivable that Europe comes out of this crisis stronger, more unified, and with a greater sense of shared purpose going forward. Now, that is clearly where we need to go. What the United States should be doing, and I think would do in a Biden administration, far from getting out of the WHO, is to say we need a better WHO. We need a strengthened one with greater resources. But what has been the flaw in an organization like the WHO is it does not have much authority to ask China for information when the Chinese government withholds it, to go into China when the Chinese government says no. It is dependent on cooperation from governments. And do you know why it's set up that way? because the United States, the primary architect, did not want the WHO messing around in the United States. So in order to get a better functioning international system, you need the great powers to agree that the rules apply to them as well. And I think that's the Rubicon that we have to cross to get to that next level of greater international cooperation. And I do think that people, broadly speaking, in the kind of Biden world, and I mean that even about Europeans, understand this. It's hard to do. It's all, there's always going to be the backlash and the people are accusing you of having sold out your country. But I do think we need to try to make steps forward. One of the great things I admire about Franklin Roosevelt is that he always understood that he was going to have to make compromises. That he never made huge, bold leaps forward, because his feeling was the important thing is the direction. If you can keep moving forward and you make a compromise here, he did very little on civil rights because he knew that he needed the South to move forward with the New Deal. And so in a sense, he left it to another day. So we need to think that way. We don't need to win everything. I mean, and the left, I think, needs to understand this, because there is a certain purity that sometimes takes over the left. You cannot advance on every front simultaneously. You have to pick your battles. You have to pick your victories. And so you move where you can and, live to fight another day on some of the other goals.
I think that's what you're saying, Fareed, is that in the end, politics, we have not found a substitute for politics. And politics is all about incremental change. And some people get that and some people don't. On the international financial architecture and international organizations, I think it is fair to say that they failed pretty miserably. You're right that Europe moved to guarantee debts and to provide capital flows to the members that needed it, but that has not been true of the world at large. The IMF at the beginning of the crisis said, emerging markets are going to need something like $2 trillion. The IMF can lend at most 1 trillion, and in reality, the IMF has lent about 200 billion. Which is about 1/10 of what the developing world and the emerging countries really needed. So one thing that we haven't talked about, which may be in the making, is either a big recession or a financial crisis or a debt crisis in many middle income and developing countries. That would be a very, very nasty subproduct or byproduct of this crisis. And the chances are, I think, maybe not in every country, but I can certainly name a few countries in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, and the Middle East, where that's a pretty high probability event. So you were fairly optimistic about the prospects for a Biden administration and sort of taking a lead to rebuild and strengthen some of these international institutions. Boy, I think that's a very urgent need. Let me end with one question that has cropped up 2 or 3 times on the chat list here. People want to know about China, because as you say in the book, and you've mentioned a couple of times, this is, back in the 50s and 60s, we had a bipolar world. Then we had a big hegemon, the US. We're back to a bipolar world, to deal with pandemics and global warming and all the other big threats. We are going to need China. Will China play ball, or will China step back?
I think it's the $1 trillion question in international relations. But I would put it, there are 2 questions. The first is, will China be willing to rise in a way that is integrated and supportive of the existing liberal international order? And the second is, will the United States allow that rise, understanding that China will then become even more powerful and influential within this order? And I think both are important. We do not have a good sense as to whether China is willing to play ball. There are some indications that it will. China, let's remember, has been remarkably responsible in terms of, things like war and peace. And the transformation there is extraordinary. Mao's China was basically the biggest rogue regime in the world. It was funding revolutionary movements everywhere from Latin America to India. the Naxalites to the shining path. And I think that that reality has so completely reversed itself that one kind of forgets that it was only 30 years ago. But China has not invaded a country since 1979 with the incursion into Vietnam. It has been fairly responsible. By the way, not a track record that any other permanent member of the Security Council can boast of, least of all the United States. So it's not an insignificant thing. The Chinese have maintained peace. They have funded UN peacekeeping now at the second highest levels, or maybe it's even the highest levels. They provide personnel for it as well. They are the second largest funders of the UN. They're trying to get better at foreign aid. So there's a lot going on that people sometimes forget about. People forget, for example, when they joined the WTO, China made more concessions than any developing country had ever made going into the WTO. Most of what they have been able to achieve that people describe as cheating is they use the WTO regulations very, very cleverly. If you go to Geneva, you will see that there is a building that houses the entire Chinese delegation of the WTO. It is probably larger than all the other countries' delegations put together. I may be exaggerating slightly, but they have determined that they will game the system, but they're not cheating as nearly as much as people think. And a large part of what they get because they're a huge country. They're a vast market, and people are willing to make concessions to them. And guess who they do that to as well? The United States. So countries that have very large, prosperous markets are used to getting the rules bent out of shape for themselves. The US does it all the time. The Chinese are doing it now. So we have to recognize some of this is about being a very large, dominant country. But some of it is cheating. Some of it is that this is inherently an illiberal, non-democratic country that is trying to, for example, cover up a bad human rights record, trying to prevent dissent and dissidents, trying to control the economy. So there is that element. But the US has its own issues, which is, as I said, fundamentally, it has to ask two questions. Is it willing to let China have the kind of influence that a second largest economy in the world would have? And is it willing to play by the rules that it wants to set out in the international order? So the United States accuses China of violating the Law of the Seas Treaty when it goes into the South China Seas. Absolutely correct. You know who is not a signatory to the Law of the Seas Treaty? The United States of America. The United States accuses countries of being war criminals, of leaders of countries of being war criminals. But the United States is itself not a signatory to the International Criminal Court. If you want to build a true international order that is multilateral, that is democratic, that is more universal, we are going to have to be part of that order. And we are going to have to live within the rules of that order to a greater extent than we are doing. So there's no question that China poses the largest threat to this order. But the US also poses a threat, either through abdication or parochialism or hypocrisy. And so what I would like to see is a kind of bargain where, the Chinese agree to be more integrationist in their views, and the US also agreed to live, to abandon some of the hypocrisy and the double standards. And so both great powers say, we will also abide by some of these rules of the road. Of course, there are going to be exceptions. Of course, there are going to be anomalies, as they have been for the last 75 years. I mean, don't forget, this 75-year period of the building of the liberal international order had lots of anomalies, lots of wars that took place outside of UN sanction, unfortunately, several genocides. So what we're looking for is, again, you put it very well, the inevitability of politics. We are looking for incremental compromises, incremental actions, but then move us in the right direction. And so, as I said, temperamentally, I'm an optimist. I have to hope that we can achieve that. We will not achieve nirvana. We are not going to achieve some transformation of the international system and the building of world peace. But we could achieve a little more integration here, a little more compliance there. And collectively and over time, guess what? That does actually transform the world.
Well, with that optimistic but also realistic message, I'm afraid we're going to have to call it a day. Farid, I'm sure we could carry on for a long time. These are fascinating subjects, and you've written a book that many people, after listening to this conversation, will probably want to go out and buy. The book is called 10 Lessons for a Post-Pandemic World, and it is available today, isn't it?
Yes.
I want to thank Farid Zakaria for joining us. This has been a fun, a fascinating conversation. I want to thank everybody else. We had at the very peak over 800 people joining this conversation from all over the world. And on behalf of the London School of Economics and of the School of Public Policy, good afternoon, everyone. Farid, thank you very much. And we will see you again very soon. Bye-bye.